Hey everyone, Elizabeth here. The Last Laugh delivers stories that leave you speechless. If you're here for it, hit subscribe and let's go.
The dinner invitation arrived on a Tuesday, handwritten on my father's personal stationery, cream cardstock with his initials embossed in navy blue. Raymond Aldridge still used monogrammed stationery in the age of text messages. That alone should have told me something was being staged. Join us for the holidays. We have something important to discuss as a family. No love, Dad. No phone call first. Just the card, slipped under the door of my apartment building by a courier who'd already left by the time my doorman brought it up. I set it on my kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. Then I called my best friend Priya. "Don't go," she said immediately. "I know." "Then why are you already figuring out what to wear?" He knew me too well. I had been staring into my closet for the past 10 minutes while holding the phone. "Because whatever they're planning," I said, "I want to be dressed for the version of this story where I win." Priya was quiet for a moment. "Do you already know what this is about?" I thought about the past 2 months. The missed calls from my stepmother, Diane. The LinkedIn message from my half-brother Cody asking, casually, whether I'd heard from any investigators lately. The way my father's assistant had called my office. My real office, not the consulting front I'd maintained for years, and hung up without leaving a message. "I have a suspicion," I said. "Nadia." Her voice dropped. "Be careful." I told her I would be. Then I went back to my closet and pulled out the charcoal blazer. My name is Nadia Aldridgeson, and by most visible measures of my life, I had spent my 30s being a quiet disappointment to my father. I drove a modest car. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a mid-range building. I took public transit to what everyone in my family believed was a mid-level consulting job at a firm no one had heard of. I didn't attend galas. I didn't post on social media. I didn't own obvious things. My father, Raymond Aldridge, was a man built for visibility. He had been a successful commercial real estate developer for 30 years. The kind of man whose name appeared on building plaques and donor walls and the acknowledgement sections of local charity galas. He wore his success loudly and considered quietness a form of failure. My mother, his first wife, had been quiet too. She died when I was 11. Breast cancer 18 months from diagnosis to the end, and my father remarried within 2 years. Diane was louder than my mother in every possible way. More jewelry. More opinions. More certainty about who deserved space at the table and who didn't. I was 14 when Diane moved in. I was 17 when I understood that I would never belong in the version of the Aldridge family she was assembling. The clearest moment came at my high school graduation dinner. My father had made a reservation at the nicest restaurant in our city. White tablecloths, a sommelier, the whole production. I arrived in a dress I'd saved for months to buy. My father looked me up and down and said, "You look fine," then spent the rest of the meal talking about Cody's travel soccer achievements. Cody was 9. He had scored a hat trick the previous Saturday. I ate my salmon and made a decision somewhere between the appetizer and the entree. I would build something that had nothing to do with Raymond Aldridge's approval. I would build it quietly and I would build it well and I would never ask him to see it. That decision, made at 17 over a plate of salmon I couldn't fully afford, became the architecture of the next 18 years of my life. I didn't set out to become wealthy. I set out to become free. Those are different goals and the difference matters. After college, a state school I attended on academic scholarship while my father paid Cody's private university tuition without being asked, I took a job at a small real estate analytics firm in Chicago. I was good at pattern recognition. I was good at seeing what a property's numbers were actually saying underneath what the seller wanted you to hear. Within 3 years I'd been promoted twice and was managing a portfolio analysis team. At 26 I made my first personal investment. A small mixed-use building in a neighborhood that the data told me was 18 months from a significant value shift. I used every dollar of savings I had and took a loan I spent 6 months qualifying for. My father, when I mentioned it at a family Christmas, said, "That's a lot of risk for someone at your income level." Diane didn't look up from her phone. The building appreciated 34% in 22 months. I reinvested. Then again. Then again. By 30, I had a portfolio that required actual management. I formed a holding company, Aldridgeson Capital Group, a name I chose deliberately, half as claim and half as private joke, and hired a small team. By 33, the portfolio had crossed the $40 million mark. By 35, it was pushing $70 million across 14 properties, 2 commercial developments, and a minority stake in a logistics technology company that had recently attracted serious acquisition interest. I told almost no one. Pre-knew. My attorney Margaret Osei knew everything. My business partner, a former city planner named David Reyes, knew the professional details but not the full personal history. My team knew their work. Nobody else needed to know more than that. The reason I kept it quiet wasn't shame. It wasn't strategy in any calculated sense. It was simpler than that. I had learned early that showing my father something I valued meant handing him away to diminish it. The safest things were the ones he couldn't see. I visited my family 3 or 4 times a year. I brought wine. I answered questions about my consulting work, vaguely but pleasantly. I watched Cody grow into a man who had inherited his mother's certainty and his father's taste for performance. I ate Diane's catered holiday meals. I drove home in my modest car and felt each time a quiet and complicated relief. This was the life I had chosen. Worked mostly. Until the stationery card arrived. The dinner was at my father's house. The house I'd grown up in, though Diane had renovated it so thoroughly after my mother died that almost nothing remained of what it had been. New kitchen, new floors, new furniture in every room. Even the backyard garden my mother had planted was gone, replaced by a stone patio with outdoor heaters. I arrived at 7. There were 6 cars in the driveway, which told me this was not, as the card had suggested, a family discussion. This was an audience. Inside, my father and Diane at the heads of the table. Cody and his wife, Renata. My Aunt Phyllis. My father's sister, the family gossip, and her husband Gerald. 2 family friends whose names I could never remember, a couple who had been attending Aldridge events since before I was born. And at the far end of the table, a man I didn't recognize. Late 50s, gray suit, a leather portfolio case on the floor beside his chair. He had the contained, watchful posture of someone used to being the most observant person in the room. I sat down. A place had been set for me between Aunt Phyllis and the empty chair beside Cody, which meant I was deliberately positioned in the middle of the table, surrounded, visible from all sides. Diane had ordered catering. The food was set out in serving dishes along the sideboard. Nobody had started eating yet. "Nadia," my father said. "Glad you could make it." "Of course," I said. I unfolded my napkin and set it in my lap. "You used the good stationery." Phyllis laughed nervously. Cody didn't. Renata studied the centerpiece. We made 40 minutes of small talk, the specific kind that happens when everyone at a table knows there is something coming but is pretending otherwise. The food friends, I would learn later their names were Walt and Susan, talked about a cruise they'd recently taken. Diane asked Cody about a golf tournament. My father watched me steadily across the table and said very little, which was unusual for him, and told me exactly how seriously he was taking this. The man at the end of the table said nothing at all. He ate carefully and watched everything. When the main course was cleared, my father set down his wine glass. "I want to address something," he said. "As a family." The table went quiet in the practiced way of people who had been waiting for this. "For several years," my father continued, "there have been questions about Nadia's professional situation. The stories have never quite added up. The vagueness about her work. The inconsistencies." He said the word carefully, like he'd rehearsed it. "I've been patient. I've given the benefit of the doubt. But there comes a point where a father has a responsibility to know the truth about his child." He paused. Diane on cue said, "We all deserve the truth." "So," my father said, "I engaged a professional." He gestured toward the man at the end of the table. "This is Mr. Robert Hale. Former federal investigator. 30 years of experience. I gave him 60 days and $13,000. He found everything." My stepmother smiled. "It's over, Nadia." Cody leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed. Phyllis was watching me with the eager attention of someone at a theater who has paid for a good seat. I said nothing. I folded my napkin once, neatly, along its original crease. I set it on the table beside my plate. I looked at Robert Hale. He was already looking at me. His expression was not the expression I had been told to expect from someone about to deliver humiliating news. It was something more careful than that. Something that looked, if I had to name it, like a professional apology delivered entirely through eye contact. Mr. Hale, my father said. Please. Robert Hale stood. He picked up his leather portfolio case and set it on the table. He opened it and removed 2 manila folders. He set them both in front of him. He did not open either one yet. Before I begin, he said, I want to be transparent about one thing. I was engaged to conduct a background and financial investigation into one individual. In the course of that investigation, standard professional practice required me to document all relevant financial connections and transactions I encountered. That scope expanded beyond the original assignment. A small silence. What does that mean? Diane said. It means, Robert Hale said, that I have 2 reports. He opened the first folder. Subject, Nadia Aldrichson. He spoke in the flat, factual tone of a man who had delivered findings for 30 years and had long since stopped dramatizing them. Age 36. Founder and managing principal of Aldrichson Capital Group, a privately held real estate and investment holding company headquartered in Chicago, Illinois. Current verified portfolio valuation, $85.3 million across 17 assets, including 12 residential and mixed-use properties, 3 commercial developments, and an 18.7% equity stake in Meridian Logistics Technologies, which received a formal acquisition offer of $340 million last quarter. He looked up once, briefly, then back down. Additional, Ms. Aldrichson holds an active Series 65 investment advisory license, sits on the board of the Lakeview Community Housing Coalition, and was recognized in the Chicago Business Journal's 40 Under 40 list 18 months ago. She has no outstanding debt beyond standard property financing, no legal actions, no criminal record. Her tax filings for the past 7 years show consistent and accurately reported income. He set the first folder down. The table was completely silent. Phyllis had stopped breathing audibly. Walt and Susan were very still. Renata had looked up from the centerpiece and was staring at me with an expression I couldn't fully categorize. Cody's arms were no longer crossed. They were on the table and he was leaning slightly forward. My father's wineglass was still in his hand. He had not set it down. His knuckles were white around the stem. 85, Diane started. Million, Robert Hale confirmed. He had not looked up. I said nothing. I watched my father's face. There is a specific quality to the moment when someone who has underestimated you finally understands the full distance of their error. It is not triumph exactly. I had imagined this moment in various forms over the years. Imagined it with satisfaction, with anger, with something that felt like justice. Sitting there watching my father's face go from shock to something much worse, I felt mostly a deep and aching sadness I hadn't expected. He had chosen not to know me. He had chosen it consistently over many years with great deliberateness. And now he was learning what that choice had cost, and it was too late to unmake it. I had not cried in a confrontation with my father since I was 22 years old. I would not cry now. But the sadness was real and it was mine, and I let it sit with me quietly while the room around me continued to fall apart. My father started. He stopped. He tried again. That can't be. The documentation is complete, Robert Hale said. Certified property valuations, corporate registration records, tax filings, board certifications, media coverage. All verified through independent sources. We would have known. People know what they're shown, Robert Hale said. He said it without inflection. Landed anyway. My father set his wineglass down. Hard. Then why, if she had all of this, why would she? He didn't finish the sentence. He may not have been able to. Mr. Aldridge, Robert Hale said. I need to continue. He reached for the second folder. I said earlier that my investigation expanded beyond the original scope. The room had not recovered from the first report. Now something shifted again, a different quality of silence. Watchful rather than stunned. Phyllis was rigid in her chair. Cody glanced at his father and looked away. During the process of tracing financial records related to Ms. Aldrichson's holdings, I encountered a series of transactions that required documentation as part of a complete professional record. These transactions were not connected to my subject. They were connected to the party that commissioned this investigation. Raymond, Diane said. Her voice was very different from what it had been 20 minutes ago. Robert Hale opened the second folder. Between March of 2019 and November of 2022, a series of transfers totaling $310,400 were made from the Aldridge Family Trust, a jointly held instrument established in 1994 with Raymond Aldridge as primary trustee, into personal accounts not associated with trust documentation. These transfers were structured in amounts ranging from $9,800 to $24,500, with irregular timing consistent with deliberate avoidance of automatic reporting thresholds. He turned a page. The trust was established in part with assets from the estate of Louise Aldridge, deceased 2001, Raymond Aldridge's mother and the maternal grandmother of both Nadia Aldridge-Chin and Cody Aldridge. The trust documentation names both Nadia Aldridge-Chin and Cody Aldridge as co-beneficiaries alongside Raymond Aldridge. As co-beneficiary, Ms. Aldridge-Chin has legal standing with regard to trust assets. Silence. Then Cody said very quietly, "Dad." My father said nothing. He had aged 10 years in the past 4 minutes. He was looking at the second folder with the expression of a man watching a structure he believed was permanent collapse in real time. Diane pushed her chair back slightly from the table, a movement so automatic she probably didn't notice she'd done it. The transfers, Robert Hale continued, represent a pattern consistent with embezzlement from a jointly held trust instrument, which under Illinois law constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and may constitute criminal fraud depending on intent and jurisdiction. I have provided a complete accounting timeline in the appendix. He closed the second folder. I've also already submitted a copy of these findings to my professional association's compliance office, as required by law when investigators encounter evidence of financial crimes during engagements. "You what?" my father said. "It's a legal requirement, Mr. Aldridge. I don't have discretion in that matter. You were hired by me to conduct a professional investigation. I did exactly that." Robert Hale looked at him with the steady patience of a man who had expected this response and had prepared for it 20 years ago. "The scope of findings is not something I control. I document what exists." Walt and Susan stood up at the same time. "We're going to," Walt began. "Of course," I said. My voice was calm. I was surprised by how calm it was. "Thank you for coming." They left quickly, and the sound of the front door closing was very loud in the quiet that followed. I looked at my father. He was looking at the second folder. He had not looked at me since Robert Hale had begun reading from it. "Dad," I said. He looked up. His eyes were red at the edges and he looked for the first time in my adult memory old. "That money," I said, "was partly from Grandma Louise's estate. She left it for both of us. For Cody and for me." "Nadia." "I'm not asking you to explain it right now." Kept my voice level. "I'm telling you what I know. And I want you to understand that I know it." Across the table, Cody was very still. He had not spoken since the one quiet word to our father. I couldn't read his face. We had never been close, Diane had made sure of that. But there was something in his expression that looked less like guilt and more like grief, and I found I couldn't be angry with him the way I had expected. He hadn't known. I was nearly certain of it. He had been a child when the trust was established, and he had been raised to believe my father was infallible. Whatever grief he was feeling now was real, and it was his to carry. "I'm going to have my attorney contact the trust administrator this week," I said. I picked up my napkin from the table and folded it again. He gave my hands something to do. "I'm not going to make any decisions tonight about how to proceed. But I want you to understand that I'm aware of my legal standing." "You would take legal action against your own father," Diane said. I looked at her. She had moved her chair back another 2 inches. "You invited me to this dinner," I said, "to humiliate me in front of family and friends. You paid $13,000 for a report you hoped would publicly destroy my credibility." I paused. "I'm not sure legal action is the most disproportionate thing that's happened tonight." Diane had no answer for that. Robert Hale was quietly closing his portfolio case. He looked at me once, briefly, and gave a single small nod. Professional to professional. Then he picked up both folders, which I noticed he did not leave behind, and walked to the front door. Phyllis and Gerald left within 2 minutes of that. Renata touched Cody's shoulder and said something quietly, and Cody nodded without looking up. I stood, straightened my blazer, and picked up my bag. "I'll be in touch through Margaret," I said to my father. He was still sitting at the table. He had not moved. He looked at me with an expression I had spent my whole life trying to earn and had stopped wanting somewhere around year 12 of trying, and now that it was on his face I found it gave me almost nothing. Too late. Too much water under too many bridges. The expression on his face was recognition, and recognition, it turned out, was not the same thing as repair. "Nadia," he said. His voice was different. Smaller. "Good night, Dad." I walked out through the front door. The outdoor heaters on the stone patio were still running, orange and warm in the November dark, heating the empty air above my mother's buried garden. I sat in my car for 4 minutes before I started the engine. I did not cry. But I sat in the silence and let the sadness have its full weight because it deserved that. Then I drove home. Margaret Osei called the next morning at 8:15 before I'd finished my first coffee. "Robert Hale is good," she said. "His compliance filing creates an automatic regulatory review trail. Your father's attorney already called my office at 7 this morning. Already. I could hear her clicking through documents. The structured transfers are a problem for him. The amount, the pattern, the trust documentation. This is textbook fiduciary breach. Criminal exposure is real, though a prosecutor would have to decide whether to pursue it. Civil action is much more straightforward. What are my options? Full civil suit for the embezzled amount plus damages. That's the nuclear option. Negotiated settlement where he repays the trust with interest. Quieter, faster, requires his cooperation. Or you document everything, send a formal demand letter, and let him decide how cooperative he wants to be. Start with the demand letter, I said. Are you sure? Given the evidence. He's my father. I set my coffee cup down. I want to give him the chance to make this right before I make it impossible for him not to. Margaret was quiet for a moment. That's generous. I'm not sure it's generous, I said. I think it's the version I'll be able to live with. She sent the demand letter by end of day. It was politely worded and absolutely clear. Full restitution of $310,400 plus accrued interest, to be remitted to the trust within 60 days, or civil proceedings would commence. My father's attorney called back within 48 hours. My father had agreed to full restitution. 3 weeks after the dinner, Priya and I were having lunch at our usual place, a Thai restaurant near her design studio where we'd been eating since we were 27 years old and couldn't afford the lunch special. We could both afford it now. We kept coming back because it was ours. How are you actually feeling? She asked. Not how's the legal situation, not how's the business. How are you actually feeling? Priya had been asking me the same question in the same tone for 15 years, and it still cut through every deflection I had. I thought about it honestly. Tired, I said. Not bad tired. Just, like I've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and I set it down, but my arms still feel the weight of it. That's real. And sad. I looked at my plate. I thought the reveal would feel like winning. I spent years imagining something like this happening and thinking it would feel like finally getting something I was owed. It doesn't feel like that. What does it feel like? Like I found out the house I grew up in had a problem with the foundation the whole time. And now I know, which is important, but knowing doesn't rebuild anything. Priya nodded slowly. She had met my father twice and liked him neither time. She had the particular loyalty of a person who had witnessed years of a dynamic others might have excused, and she had never once told me I was exaggerating or being too sensitive. I loved her deeply for that. What happens with Cody? She asked. I don't know, I said honestly. He called me, left a voicemail, said he had no idea about the trust withdrawals and that he was sorry for his part in, he called it, the whole setup. The dinner. Are you going to call him back? I think so. Eventually. He's not blameless. But he's also spent his entire life being shaped by Raymond and Diane, and I think he's starting to notice the shape of him. That's very charitable. I'm in a generous phase, I said. She laughed. It was real laughter and it felt good. The restaurant was warm and slightly too loud and smelled like lemongrass, and I was 36 years old with $85 million in assets and a best friend who had never once let me down in a life that was, in most of the ways that mattered, genuinely good. The grief about my father was real. It would probably always be real. There was no version of this story where I got a different father, or where he became the father I'd needed. The story I actually had was the one where I built something extraordinary largely because of what he failed to give me, and the two things, the loss and the building, were permanently tangled together. I wasn't sure they would ever fully separate. I wasn't sure they were supposed to. The Meridian Logistics acquisition closed 4 months later. My equity stake returned $63.4 million, which I rolled partially into a new development project and partially into a foundation I'd been structuring for 2 years, focused on affordable housing development in neighborhoods that were 18 months from significant value shifts. The same analytics that had made me wealthy pointed in a different direction. David Reyes ran the foundation's operations. He was very good at it. The demand letter was honored. $310,400 plus interest arrived in the trust account on the 58th of the 60 days allowed. My father did not contact me directly. His attorney managed the entire transaction. I did not know if he would ever call. I did not know if I would answer if he did. I kept the apartment. I kept the modest car. I kept taking public transit on days when the weather was good and I had time to think. I kept having lunch at the Thai restaurant with Priya. I kept building the things I was building quietly and well, and I let the people who needed to see it, and I let the rest remain invisible. Cody and I had coffee in January. It was awkward and short and ended with a handshake that neither of us seemed to know how to upgrade into something warmer. He said he was proud of what I'd built. I believed him. Thanked him. We agreed to try again in a few months. It was not a reconciliation. It was the beginning of the possibility of one. That was honest, which was the most I could ask. Aunt Phyllis, true to form, told everyone she knew within 72 hours of the dinner. I heard this from 3 different people before the week was out. The story she told was not exactly accurate. She inflated some numbers, softened my father's role, added details she could not have known, but the essential shape of it was true, and the essential shape was enough. I did not correct it publicly. I did not post about it. I did not need the world to know every detail. I knew what had happened. The people who mattered knew. The documents existed. That was sufficient. On a Saturday in late February, I drove out to a property I was developing on the east side of the city. A mixed-use building on a corner lot that had been vacant for 6 years. The construction was at framing stage, the skeleton of the structure exposed against a pale winter sky. I stood outside it for a while with a coffee from the cart 2 blocks over, looking at what was being built. You could see the shape of the thing in the bones of it before the walls go up. The way the floors would be laid out, the place where the lobby would open, the floor plates that would eventually hold apartments for 62 families. My phone buzzed. A message from David about a zoning board meeting. A message from Margaret about a title insurance question. A message from Priya with a photo of a sweater she was considering buying and asking for my opinion. I answered Priya first. The sweater was great. He should get it. I sent the message and slipped my phone back in my pocket and finished my coffee standing in front of the rising frame of a building that was mine, in a city that had given me room to become something, in a life that had cost real things and built real things in equal measure. The sky was pale and cold and very clear. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was mine.